Okay, this is lesson 6 for writing accessible HTML. In this lesson, I'm going to walk you through the process step by step of inserting properly formatted elements into the body of an HTML document. So we're going to continue learning additional elements that are visible to site visitors, elements in the body portion of your HTML document. In this lesson, we'll be specifically looking at tables and how to code them properly for HTML validation as well as accessibility. This is a fairly simple table example, and I'll begin the explanations. Notice here in a table tag, the table tag has an opening and a closing tag, both at the top and at the bottom. Each individual row of a table is indicated by a TR tag, which has an opening and a closing tag. The first row of a table, when you are talking about a traditional table with a header row across the top and subsequent content rows below, would start with a TH tag for table header. The TH tag has an opening and a closing tag. A TH tag also has an attribute called scope. This is for accessibility as well as for semantic meaning. The purpose of this is to identify, does this table header cell have a scope of a column of information going down or a row of information going across? Now, you've probably seen tables that have header information on along the top indicating importance or the meaning for each column, and a header row along the left-hand side indicating meaning for each row. Now, this would be the normal type of a layout for, say, a salary schedule, where you would have individual increments along the salary schedule identified by the header row along the top and the individual job classifications or titles along the row on the left, indicating that the salary amounts in the grid form of the table have meaning both as which step of the salary they're on and which job title it belongs to. We're not going to discuss a table of that complexity in this particular example. However, that's something that's important to keep in mind, that those tables exist and the scope attribute identifies meaning for those purposes. In this case, we have a scope attribute on the table header cell and a value of column. The content of the cell is name. That would indicate this information here. And the table header cell to the right of that is an email column, and the scope is identified for column. So these table header cells are contained within a table row tag. The next table row that we have is a content row. The reason we can tell that is because there's a standard table cell tag, TD, and a closing tag. So this is content for that first column. So you can see here we have our name header, John Smith being a name, Betty Brown being a name. We have the second row with table content cells, TD, that are also closed, and name and email content contained within that. So the importance of using scope is for semantic meaning as well as to help with accessibility. Well, the way that the scope attribute helps with accessibility is as such. Let me explain. If I am visually impaired and using a screen reader to help me read the content of the web page, when I come across a table with that software, the table code will be read by the assistive technology to see whether or not there are table header cells first and whether or not there are scope attributes identified. If there are, then the contents of that tag will be read prior to the contents of any cell within that scope. For example, the screen reader software will come down and say table header, name, email. Next row, name, John Smith. The screen reader will actually say what is in the content of the table header cell before reading the contents of the cells in that scope. Then it would say email, john.smith@gmail.com. Next row, name, Betty Brown. Email, b_brown_36@aol.com. And so on and so forth. So if you do not have TH cells in your first table row and a scope attribute identified, then a screen reader will not be able to give the context of what the meaning is of the contents of the cell. It will simply read the contents of the cell. Having that table header content to read prior makes it more meaningful and more beneficial. So, some recommendations for you for best practices when using tables. Do not use tables for layout purposes. If you want to position content here or there or in rows or so on and so forth, a table will provide that for you visually, but it is not valid to do so, and it also breaks accessibility and usability of the page. Use cascading style sheets instead if you need to position content on the page visually. We're not going to be covering CSS in this course, but that would be how you would accomplish that. Also, always use a header row of table cells, TH tags, when using tables to provide context for the table cells in their respective columns. So I recommend that you practice working with tables with the scope attribute, and wouldn't even be a bad idea for you to download a trial version of JAWS screen reader or Window Eyes. There's a Fangs plugin for Firefox. There are a number of assistive technologies that you can use on a trial basis to test to see how they work. There are also add-ins, plugins for various browsers that you can try to just get an idea of what your content means to someone with a visual impairment and how to properly code it.